Much of the discussion around Overwatch 2's balance is muddled and increasingly unproductive. So what do I mean by that? Well, the focus of this video is to spark a conversation. I'm looking to augment the balance philosophy we as players use to discuss Overwatch. The player base of Overwatch is vast, variable, and volatile, ranging from middle-aged fathers to teenage esports prodigies strapped to gaming toilets. As such, to facilitate a productive dialogue, I want to present a framework for how we as players approach crafting balanced concepts and suggestions. In essence, we all play video games to have fun, but where that fun comes from varies. The perspective of every player deserves to be heard. My goal is to supply the tools of constructive criticism, not to speak for everybody. This video has two parts. First, I'll present 5 rules to guide the balance debate. In the second part, I'll provide examples of my rules in action. Together, we'll dive deeper into the philosophy of Overwatch balance. But before we begin, I want to put forth some questions for you to ponder throughout the video. What is fun in the context of Overwatch? How do we craft concepts that solve issues for the long term? And can we balance this game to be both fun and competitively viable?
With such a pain to be alone and lonely in the rain. And
To start off, I think it's important that you all know where I'm coming from in my experience with Overwatch. I've been playing off and on at varying levels of interest since OW1 launched in 2016. I took an extended break shortly after Ashe launched, returning briefly when BAP and Sigma dropped. Since then, I didn't play the game until OW2 launched late last year. In OW1, I peaked at High Diamond as primarily a tank player. This was before the advent of role queue. Currently though, I primarily play quick play. I peaked at GM3 as support, with my tank and DPS role sitting at mid diamond. If I were to just say, make the game fun and call it a day, that wouldn't be very helpful now, would it? Instead, I'm going to boil down my definitions of fun Overwatch into these 5 fundamental rules. Each of these is essential to inform balanced concepts and criticisms conducive to improving the game. 1. Each role must be defined and consistent. What is it that tanks do? Why should I be excited to pick tank over other roles? Are they resigned to be ability and damage sponges? Perhaps you think it's their job to take and deny space, or should they be an imposing presence in a teamfight that you must work around rather than tunnel through? Not all these concepts are mutually exclusive. We'll come back to these definitions later. 2. Consider every player in a given match. How does a tank interact with the other 9 players, or on a more macro scale, by allowing all 3 roles to have some form of soft or hard CC, you enable situations where one player can be chain stunned for more than 10 seconds. Sure, the abilities are fun for the side using them, but it's certainly not for the receiving party. At this point, we're just begging to return to Overwatch 1. 3. Balance cannot be strictly numerical. Of course, number changes are the easiest in terms of concept, developer hours, and immediacy. However, they can only alleviate so much tension in the long term. Often, making these types of changes incrementally exaggerates specific issues, such as the immense damage and healing creep streamers like Flats have talked about.
I do think the numbers have gotten insane, but I don't think it's just support fault. I don't think it's support fault alone. I think it's just in general. I think that damage numbers for tanks, damage numbers for DPS, and damage numbers for supports and healing numbers have all gotten too high for what the health pools are.
Though, crucially, I want to stress the strictly part of this point. Changing numbers is not inherently bad, and often can be a good thing. Take Bastion as an example. The recent change to his weapon spread is a number change, but does not affect his most irritating matchup, shredding tanks. Now, if this change were alternatively a nerf to his per pellet damage, perhaps even tightening the spread of his weapon slightly, we maintain or perhaps strengthen his effectiveness against squishies at short to mid ranges, all while attenuating his threat against tanks. Obviously, many may argue Bastion needs a full-scale rework, which I don't disagree with, but this demonstrates the value of appropriate number changes for short-term adjustments. 4th, control and counterplay are essential. The feeling of being in control of your character, like you lost a fight to the player and not the game, is critical for any shooter. We should strive for nearly every death to feel like, man, if only I saved my ult, or if I landed my ability, I would have won. In the same vein, long cooldowns are antithetical to being in control of your hero. Abilities like Lamp and Life Grip, which are only seen about once per fight, feel terrible on both sides. Leaning into these impactful but infrequent abilities creates clunky kits, which ultimately feel inconsistent. As Spylo recently argued on an episode of the Group Up podcast,
the point needs to be shorter cooldowns, more choices, more counterplay. And you can't fix that by changing the cooldown. You decrease the frequency of that instance, but it still feels terrible. If they increased Hog hook duration to 10 seconds, right, the cooldown, it would still feel terrible. for somebody to get hooked. If they increased Suzu to 25 seconds, it still would feel terrible. So for me, it should be slightly less impactful abilities that are not game changing, that have counterplay, and that allow more frequent decisions. And then they need to try to introduce, through character design as well as ability design, abilities that always have counterplay. We either need to stop making characters like Roadhog or Malga, who you have zero way of playing around CDs and spam. They have nothing. Or we need to change the way that those abilities that those tanks struggle with the most.
The most complained about abilities in Overwatch, more often than not, have fundamental flaws in their design. Decreasing the theoretical frequency of these abilities is detrimental to both the controlling player and the opposition. The abilities will still be used in the same way as before. Instead, increasing the cooldown only acts to the detriment of lower ranked players who lack the judgment to perfect their ability usage. Fifth, not everything needs a rework. This point was best articulated by Daniel Fenner on that same episode of the Group Up podcast.
I just think that it's okay to have heroes that not everybody loves. As a support player, this comes up with Moira a lot. Like, a lot of people want to see Moira changed. It's like she's got no utility. She doesn't help the team. You don't see her in pro play. I see that as okay. There's people who play Moira, they like Moira, and they do well on Moira. Like, Moira does well on ladder, and that's fine. I think it's okay that Moira is not going to see time in the Overwatch League if there are people who like playing Moira. I think they should be careful with reworks because, like, people like heroes, and if they get reworked, then they might not like that hero.
Pending what Daniel said, I think when we consider reworking a hero, we should also ask, how can we diversify ability interactions without changing the fundamental feel of this hero? Not necessarily making the hero viable in the meta, but increasing the scenarios in which they can be used. So with those rules laid out, I have a few specific examples that I'd like to go over. Starting off with rule 1, I'm going to create a broad definition of each role. Beginning with something easy and foundational, the DPS role. I think this role is best described as pressure creators, and by extension, space creators. Now you may be thinking, isn't that the tank's job? Well, yes and no. Let me explain. DPS create pressure through various means, whether it be the off angles a tracer takes, altering the map geometry like Mei's wall, accelerating access to a position like Sim's TP, or through the threat of their raw damage potential like Genji. These all effectively create space by forcing enemies out of position. So then, how do tanks differ? I would define tanks as the deniers. Not just space deniers, though most do just that. Each tank denies a specific aspect of the enemy team's advantage. Some tanks like Orisa deny space by being an unkillable wall. Shared between Orisa, D.Va, and Sigma is the ability to deny utility through absorbing projectiles. Tanks like Ball and Doomfist deny both space and angles by literally pushing enemies out of position. Sigma baits utility through long-range damage pressure. He also, along with Ryan and Winston, denies utility, ult charge, and poke damage through intelligent shield usage. You'll note this category is very broad, but you'll also note that it does not require tanks to absorb utility by taking the full brunt of it. Most meta tanks have presence primarily through the threat of their lethality, coupled with abilities that allow them to mitigate the utility that is used against them. Alright, now we'll tackle probably the most challenging role to define. Support is extremely diverse. Commonly, they all heal, but that doesn't encapsulate all they have to do in a game. Ultimately, I think the term support is the most accurate descriptor of this role. They prop up their teammates through healing, utility, or damage pressure. Good support players help their team maintain and create space by sustaining them through the enemy's pressure. Support players often create the openings which allow their team to capitalize on a kill, whether that be through anti-nade, Kiriko or Yari headshots landing a pick, or Lucio speed boosting your team in for an aggressive play. But they can also stabilize a team fight. Take a Lucio speed boosting your team out of danger, or ultimates like Zen's Trans and Mercy's Valk. I think support is by far the most versatile role, at least in Overwatch 2. Probably why it's the most played, but what they all have in common is the ability to press and stabilize their team's advantage. With all that said, how do we actually use this when discussing balance? To elucidate on that, I'm going to present some of my concepts and criticisms about the game, and I'll explain how they are informed by my 5 rules. Hopefully, my concepts can serve as examples or starting points for your own ideas, which I'd love for you to share in the comments. Starting us off with rule 3, I have this concept for a rework of anti-healing effects. Now, this comes packaged with a whole lot of other reworks and changes for other heroes, following my second rule. But starting with Ana, her anti-nade would function as a healing absorb rather than a full stop to healing for its entire duration. Where the actual balance numbers lie will take some testing obviously, but Let's say 200 for now. This could be displayed in-game with a purple outline on the health bar as it is now, but instead it fills up as you heal through the absorb, after which point the absorb would disappear and any remaining healing would apply normally. To counteract this huge nerf to the ability, the cooldown would be reduced quite substantially, perhaps some 3 to 5 seconds. So how does this change adhere to my 5 rules? Rule 1. Anti-nade no longer acts as a hard counter to Zen's ultimate. Though this matchup wasn't the worst because of the skill involved in baiting the CD, the decreased cooldown on nade should compensate for the lost potential aggression with a renewed capacity to stabilize your own team through Transcendence's duration, thus fitting our definition of support. Rule 2. Another matchup we've diversified with this change is against abilities like Hog's Take a Breather. Whereas before, Anti-Nade completely shut down Hog's Sustain, now the Hog has a choice. Does he use some of his healing to push through the absorb, or can his support recover him? He's not resigned to death or hiding behind a corner now. The Hog has options without eviscerating the impact the Ana has in this matchup. Rule 3. With this rework, we fundamentally changed how anti-healing effects interact with players for the long-term benefit of the game. Additionally, this gives us further options for number tweaks beyond duration, as we can also adjust the absorb amount to either strengthen or weaken the ability as necessary. Rule 4. The impact of anti-nade is lessened, but in exchange we've made a more frequent and engaging ability. Beyond just the Ana, the opposing team is now presented with more diverse counterplay opportunities for this ability. Should they retreat to heal off the absorb, or should the BAP use regen burst to stabilize his team? Rule 5. With this change, we have given Moira's healing orb added utility and being a great method to clear the absorb from multiple teammates, all without changing Moira herself. Also, Ana's grenade stays largely the same gameplay-wise. Barring the more frequent usage, Ana players should find this change just as engaging as before. Another rework I'd make to support this change to anti-healing effects is to Kiriko's Protection Suzu. This should also mend much of the frustration with the ability. I'd remove the cleanse effect, shorten the invulnerability, potentially remove the intangibility, and allow it to burst heal for 70 or more baseline. Also, to compensate for this considerable nerf, I'd reduce the cooldown by some 2 to 5 seconds. If we were to remove the intangibility effect, I would append that with immunity to stuns or knockbacks for the duration. The idea being that Doomfist would be stopped as if punching a fortified Orisa instead of slipping right through them. Alright, so how have my 5 rules informed this idea? Rule 1. Using our definition of support, Kiriko can sustain her team through moments of lethal burst damage with a well-timed Suzu. Rule 2. If we reduce the cooldown of Suzu significantly, I think increasing Swift Step's cooldown by 1 to 2 seconds would help in giving her moments of vulnerability. Her wall climb passive is already a strong evasion tool, and Swift Step is a fun but often annoying ability when on the opposing end. Rule 3. The removal of Cleanse with the addition of a consistent heal diminishes its effectiveness against anti-nade while remaining a strong counterplay when your whole team is hit. Furthermore, Suzu no longer hard counters ultimates like Shatter and Rampage. The latter we'll get into in a moment. Rule 4. The reduced cooldown of Suzu along with the removal of Cleanse produces skill expression through fast reaction times. It is still possible to stop an Earth Shatter with some really good timing or an apt prediction. No Cleanse and shorter invulnerability reduce her impact when teleporting into a 1v1. Increasing the Swift Step CD would also expand the window of opportunity to punish the Kiriko in these situations. Finally, Rule 5. We keep the most fun aspects of Suzu, like timing it to survive a Diva Bomb, negating a Doomfist punch, or avoiding being burned by Ashe's dynamite. All of these are still possible with some pinpoint reactions or predictive timing. Finally, let's talk about Queen's ultimate given this healing absorb concept. Very simply, I'd have her apply the same effect as our reworked anti-nade, except this would have a slightly larger absorb. Of course, adhering to Rule 2, we must consider how our reworked Suzu would interact with this ult. Seeing as the only impact Suzu would have in this matchup is the burst heal or a potential to deny the ultimate with good timing, perhaps an absorb of 300 would be manageable. Of course, subject to testing. Bring back experimental mode. Alright, now how does this conform to rules 1, 3, 4, and 5? Well, rule 1, as it did before, Rampage still denies healing to the impacted targets, thus fitting our definition of tanks being deniers. 3, as this change is largely identical to Ana's, I think the same point applies here. 4. Supports other than Kiriko have gained a dynamic in this matchup as they all have the ability to heal through the absorb. I think Lucio would be the most interesting because he gets the choice between amping speed or healing depending on the situation. 5. Just like our Ana rework, Rampage's impact stays largely the same. Of course, we'll need to test and monitor monitor the absorb amount to ensure the ult remains impactful without being uncounterable. So that was probably my most complex rework idea. Now, I'd like to take a step back and look at just one ability, specifically Baptiste Lamp. This suggestion is nothing new, but simply put, I changed Immortality Field to Damage Reduction Field. Now, I have heard the argument that this doesn't fit the name, but honestly everyone calls it Lamp anyway. Ignoring the precise numbers of the damage reduction and lamp health for the sake of the video, let's focus on how this change fits my rules. First of all, the overall function of Lamp being a tool to save and stabilize your team is kept. Second, I want to consider how this affects the sniper matchup. Personally, I often use Lamp to peek Widows, and this is absolutely still possible. However, the Widow is now given a chance to kill me with a skillful set of headshots, or at least force me to back up. Because if I get hit, I know there is nothing preventing me from dying to a follow-up shot. Rule 3. We've removed the most frustrating component of Lamp, the immortality. It is now technically possible to kill a target in a Lamp, though it may be extremely difficult. This leads to Rule 4. We diversify the skill expression of Lamp on both sides. As the BAP, you no longer waste the Lamp if you place it early. There's utility in preventing bursts of damage or allowing your other support to reload. On the opposite side, you are now presented with a choice. Do you switch targets to the Lamp and break it, or should you try to burn your target through the damage reduction? Perhaps you have a knockback to push them out of the Lamp's radius. Regardless, there is more control and more counterplay. I'd also argue this change adheres to Rule 5. This is not a complete rework of his kit. The Lamp still exists to prevent your teammates from dying. BAP players who enjoy him now will continue to do so. If anything, this change could allow for a major cooldown reduction, allowing for multiple Lamps to be used per teamfight. Those are just a handful of ideas informed by my 5 rules, but before I leave you, let's return to those questions I presented at the start of the video. So, what is fun in the context of Overwatch? Overwatch is a game with 39 unique heroes, and that roster is still growing. I think, universally, players have the most fun when they master any one or multiple of these kits in all kinds of scenarios. Hero swapping is a fun and integral part of the game, but should never be compulsory. Removing situations where you're forced to swap produces diversity for hero interactions and combos, and allows players to play the heroes that they identify with most. So, how can we craft concepts that solve issues long term? If we keep in mind the 5 rules I laid out in this video, we're forced to consider all the angles and complexities that balancing a game like Overwatch presents. We have the tools to not only craft our own ideas, but to help each other polish theirs. We are an increasingly diverse community of players from all backgrounds and skill levels. It is important that we can all have fun and enjoy this game we've invested so much of our time and love into. So remember to be kind to each other. Can we balance this game to be both fun and competitively viable? Probably one of the oldest questions in gaming in general, and this question is still hotly debated to this day. In my opinion, yes, we can. When we diversify counterplay opportunities, we create more instances of skill expression. Overwatch is at its best in terms of both fun and competitiveness when your skill as a player is displayed in your decision-making and mechanical skill. The most frustrating mechanics in Overwatch are often the least competitive. On the other hand, the most fun abilities are the ones which allow both that hero and anyone playing against them to make inspiring plays that turn the tide of a fight. Also, this type of balancing would improve Overwatch as an esport. After all, the most fun pro play matches to watch are the ones where they pull off crazy combos and counterplays in novel ways. That is the version of Overwatch we should be vying for. So, what balance ideas do you have? How would your concepts fit the framework I presented? Maybe there's more I should have mentioned? Perhaps you disagree with some of my ideas. Let's start a conversation and learn from each other. Thanks for listening. I hope you all have a wonderful day.
Ready to listen to a beautiful concert.